The decision to enlist, once conceived in the silent sovereignty of his own mind, detonated in the atmosphere of the Barnes family home like a smoke grenade, suffocating normalcy and obscuring everything with a haze of tension. The silence that followed his announcement was not peaceful. It was an armistice, a fragile ceasefire on a domestic Cold War battleground. His mother, Mary, became a master of passive aggression, waging her campaign not with shouts, but with the surgical precision of acts and omissions. The dishes were put away with a restrained force that made the porcelain clatter in protest. The TV channel was abruptly changed if any image of a uniform or conflict appeared on the screen, and the act of asking, "How was your day?" was removed from her vocabulary, leaving a vacuum that screamed louder than any accusation. To Jake, the weight of her gaze was a physical pressure, a look that accused him not just of recklessness, but of a fundamental cruelty, of an ingratitude that broke her heart. His father, Michael, on the other hand, became Switzerland in their conflict, a neutral territory haunted by the tension on its borders. He would retreat to the garage, the smell of sawdust and oil becoming his sanctuary, but even there the tension found him. Jake saw the conflict in his father's hands, the way he tightened a wrench with unnecessary force, the hesitation before starting a new project. He was caught between the pride he saw in his son and the fear he saw in his wife. For Jake, his childhood home, with its familiar scent of cinnamon and clean laundry, now smelled of betrayal and confinement. The atmosphere was so thick he could barely breathe, and this emotional asphyxiation, rather than dissuading him, only chiseled his resolution into stone. The army was no longer just an escape from a future of rust. It became an immediate necessity, an escape from the most intimate and painful of battlefronts, with the determination of a man fleeing his own burning. Home, Jake returned to the air-conditioned oasis of Sergeant Harris's office. The contrast between the Cold War at his house and the clinical chill of the recruiting office was stark. The air here wasn't heavy with emotion, but with the scent of paper and cleaning products, a clinical coldness that was, in a way, a relief. Sergeant Harris, the architect of his escape plan, now revealed himself in his true form, not a savior, but a functionary, the first in a long line of bureaucratic gatekeepers to his new world. The previous conversation, full of promises of purpose and a future, was replaced by the prosaic reality of paperwork. A stack of forms, as thick as a novel, was placed before Jake. Every page was a new inquiry into his existence, a dissection of his life up to that point. He felt the mythology he had built around his grandfather's military service begin to crumble, replaced by the sterile, indifferent machinery of the armed forces. Where was the honor in filling out Form DD? 1966. Where was the glory in a vaccination checklist? Harris guided him through the process with the patience of an undertaker, his voice a monotone of instructions. Initial here, Barnes. No. The date in day, month, year format. Check no if you've never had tuberculosis. Jake felt less like a future warrior and more like someone applying for a mortgage. He had to list every scar, every childhood illness, every bone he'd ever broken. The military machine, he realized, was not interested in his spirit. It was interested in his chassis, his history, his viability as an asset. It was a process of quantification, of reducing him to a series of data points in a manila folder. As he left the office that day, with a date for his MEPS physical in hand, the euphoria of his decision had been entirely replaced by a new heavy sobriety. He was entering a system, and his first test of loyalty wasn't to his country, but to its paperwork. The military entrance processing station in Cleveland was a purgatory of linoleum and fluorescent lights that hummed with a constant, unnerving note. Jake arrived on a bus before dawn, a vehicle filled with other young men, each one a universe of private hopes and fears, all about to be homogenized. The atmosphere was a toxic blend of testosterone, anxiety, and the smell of cheap deodorant trying to mask cold sweat. Inside, individuality was the first casualty. They were no longer Jake or Mike or Carlos. They were a batch, an indistinct group of bodies to be measured, tested, and stamped. They were herded through labyrinthine corridors by tired, impatient sergeants from different branches. The journey was a series of stations of progressive humiliation, the vision test in a machine that looked like an archaic torture device, the hearing test in a claustrophobic booth, the indignity of having to provide a urine sample under the watchful eye of a supervisor to ensure there was no cheating. The peak was the group physical, stripped too, their underwear in a cold room, a parade of adolescent insecurities. The doctor led them through a series of bizarre movements, culminating in the infamous duck walk, a squatting exercise that was as much a test of joint function as it was a ritual of ego-breaking. Jake tried to retreat into his mind, to focus on a crack in the ceiling, to remember his grandfather's face, anything to distance himself from the reality of being treated like livestock at a county fair. He saw the machine in its purest essence, a cold engine sorting the useful components from the defective ones, a brutal reminder that his dream was just an application being processed. The moment that would define his ordeal came not in a shout, but in a clinical touch. In a small examination room, an army doctor, a major with a look of profound boredom and fingers that moved with robotic efficiency, went down the checklist on Jake's body. He twisted Jake's ankle, checked his reflexes, and then his hands arrived at the right knee, the epicenter of his past, the graveyard of his football dream, the joint that held the story of his greatest failure. The doctor's face, until then a mask of professional boredom, twitched with a flicker of interest. His fingers, surprisingly strong, probed the joint, finding the tiny, almost invisible scar from the arthroscopic surgery. "We've got a history here, Barnes," he stated, not asked. His voice was neutral, devoid of sympathy. Jake felt a chill run down his spine. He explained about the senior year football injury, downplaying it, using the word recovered like a shield. The doctor had him stand, squat, jump. Every movement was a test, and Jake felt his knee send signals of protest, a familiar phantom ache he had trained himself to ignore. But the doctor was an expert in pain. He saw the slight hesitation in the squat, the way Jake favored the other leg upon landing. He said nothing, but his red pen moved across the clipboard with the finality of a scalpel, circling the section on joint instability. Jake's heart plummeted. The past, which he was so desperately trying to escape, had reached out and grabbed him by the ankle. The same injury that ended his first dream now threatened to kill his second, before it even had a chance to begin. The verdict was delivered at the end of a day that felt like a year. It was handed down unceremoniously by a Marine sergeant at the final processing station, a man who chewed tobacco and looked at Jake as if he were a typo. "Barnes, your file's been flagged. Temporary disqualification, pre-existing instability in the right knee. You can apply for a medical waiver, but don't hold your breath." The words were clinical, emotionless, but to Jake, they felt like a death sentence. Disqualification. The word was an insult, a brand, a stamp of defective on his soul. The door to his future, which had seemed so solidly open, was now slamming shut in his face. He felt humiliated, angry, and above all, powerless. He returned to Sergeant Harris's office the next day, clinging to a shred of hope that his recruiter, the man who sold him the dream, would help him. But Sergeant Harris was a salesman, and Jake was now damaged goods. The easy smile was gone, replaced by a poorly disguised impatience. "Look, kid," Harris said, not even looking up from his other files. "Waivers are a headache. The paperwork is a mountain, and 90% of them get denied. Like I said, maybe community college isn't so bad." The casual indifference was more crushing than any formal rejection. Jake was not a soldier in training. He was an inconvenience. He realized with a soul-crushing clarity that he was completely alone in this. The vast, powerful military machine he so desperately wanted to join had spit him out before it had even swallowed him. He walked out of the recruiting office, and the air of Clayton, once suffocating, now felt like the only air he would ever breathe. He arrived home that night feeling like a shipwrecked sailor. The defeat was written on his face, in his posture. His mother, Mary, upon seeing him, could not hide a sigh of relief. To her, this was divine intervention, a second chance to keep her son safe. "Oh, Jake, honey," she said, her sympathy like vinegar in an open wound. "Don't you worry. Maybe it's for the best. Destiny has other plans for you." The mention of destiny, as if his failure were a cosmic favor, made Jake's stomach turn. It was his father who saved him. Michael watched the exchange in silence, his jaw tight. Later, when Jake was on the back porch kicking at a loose stone in the concrete, Michael came out and sat beside him. They sat in silence, the sound of crickets filling the space between them. Then Michael spoke. "Back in '98, he said, his voice low and gravelly, The plant brought in a new robotics line. My supervisor, some kid with a college degree who'd never gotten his hands dirty, said I was too old to learn the new system. He put me on cleanup, sweeping floors. After 25 years on that line, Jake looked at his father. Everyone told me to accept it. At least you have a job. But I went to the library every night for 6 weeks. I read the manuals. I learned that damn machine on my own. One day the system went down and the kid with the degree couldn't fix it. I did. He paused. I didn't do it for them, Jake. I did it for me, to prove they couldn't tell me who I was. He put his hand on Jake's shoulder. If you really want this, son, you don't let a doctor with a clipboard stop you. You fight. You make them say yes. In that moment, Michael didn't just give Jake permission to fight. He gave him a battle plan, and more importantly, the certainty that he was not fighting alone. Jacob Barnes's war for his medical waiver began the next morning. He woke with a new sense of purpose, a cold anger that was far more powerful than his previous idealism. His first mission would not be fought in a foreign desert, but in the hallways of hospitals and on the athletic fields of his own town. He became a scholar of military regulations, spending hours at the library researching the labyrinthine process for a medical appeal. He needed evidence, a mountain of it. He went to his old football coach, a burly man named Patterson, who, moved by a pang of guilt over Jake's injury, wrote a passionate letter detailing not just Jake's athletic ability, but his work ethic and his resilience. He made appointments with specialists, paying out of pocket with the money he'd saved from the roofing job, collecting reports and MRI scans like a lawyer building a case. But the most crucial battlefield was his own body. He began a self-imposed, brutal and methodical training regimen. Every morning he ran, ignoring the ache in his knee, forcing it to grow stronger. He spent hours in the high school weight room, focusing on exercises to build up the supporting muscles, the ligaments. Every squat, every leg extension was an act of defiance. He was waging a war against the weakness of his own flesh, against the story his body told about him. The pain became his constant companion, a reminder of what was at stake, and he used it, transforming it from an impediment into fuel. He was no longer just trying to escape Clayton. He was actively fighting for his right to leave. The process of rehabilitating his knee became, unexpectedly, a rehabilitation of his soul. Each painful physical therapy session forced him to revisit the trauma of his football failure, not as a distant memory but as a present physical sensation. The ache in his cartilage was the echo of the ache in his lost identity. For years, he had built a narrative around that injury. He was a victim of bad luck, a promising talent cut short. It was a story that allowed him a certain nobility in his stagnation. Now, in the solitude of the gym, sweating and grunting, he was forced to confront a more uncomfortable truth. Maybe he hadn't fought hard enough back then. Maybe he had surrendered to the victim narrative too easily. He began to dissect the failure, not as an event, but as a series of choices. He realized the deepest pain hadn't been the torn ligament, but the feeling of powerlessness that followed. His quest for the army, he now understood, wasn't just a search for a future, but a search to recapture his own agency, to prove to himself that he wasn't defined by his weaknesses, but by how he responded to them. This epiphany freed him. He stopped seeing the knee as a traitor and began to see it as a teacher. The injury had humbled him, yes, but it had also forced him to look for a strength that didn't depend on applause or a scoreboard. He was no longer just healing a knee. He was rewriting the narrative of his own failure, transforming it from an ending into a prologue. After months of a relentless campaign, Jake finally got his audience. An appointment with Colonel Madsen, head of orthopedics at a military base. 3 hours away. The office was austere, the walls adorned with anatomical diagrams and framed certificates. Madsen was the personification of military authority, a man in his 60s with a buzz cut that defied his grey hair and pale blue eyes that seemed to analyze Jake at a cellular level. He dismissed Jake's stack of paperwork with a wave of his hand. "Your paperwork tells me you're broken, Barnes," he said, his voice like gravel. "Your coach says you have heart. Your doctor says you're healed. I don't trust any of them. I trust what I see. Now stand up." What followed was less an examination and more a torture test. Madsen had Jake run on a treadmill at inclines that felt like cliffs, jump from platforms, perform single-leg squats with weights until lactic acid screamed in his muscles. It was a calculated ordeal, designed to make the knee fail. Jake responded with a fierce silence. He channeled the image of his father in the garage, the dismissive smirk of Harris, the pity in his mother's eyes. He used every ounce of his anger and his hope as fuel. The pain was a white-hot explosion behind his eyes, but he refused to falter. He was in a field test for his first and most important war, the war against the perception that he was weak. He wasn't asking for a chance, he was demonstrating with every drop of sweat that he had already earned it. After an hour that felt like a century, Colonel Madsen finally said, "Enough." Jake stood in the middle of the room, his chest heaving, drenched in sweat, his legs trembling from exhaustion, but his eyes were locked on the Colonel's, refusing to be the first to look away. Madsen circled him like a wolf inspecting its prey, his face an unreadable mask. He picked up Jake's clipboard, looked at the MRI scans, then looked back at Jake. The silence stretched, each second an agony. "Your MRI looks like trash," Madsen said bluntly. "Any other doctor would have sent you home. Your cartilage is worn. You'll have arthritis by the time you're 40. Jake's heart sank. "But," the Colonel continued, and that single word shifted the axis of the world, "a warrior's body isn't defined by its perfection, but by its ability to function under stress. Your determination has compensated for your deficiency. I've seen men with perfect knees quit in the first week." He picked up a pen. The sound of the nib scratching across the waiver form was the sweetest sound Jake had ever heard. "I'll sign it," Madsen said, "but understand this, Barnes. If that knee fails you in the field, it doesn't just fail you. It fails the man on your left and the man on your right. Don't make me regret this." Jake could only manage a "No, sir," his voice hoarse with exhaustion and relief. Madsen's signature wasn't just ink on paper. It was validation, victory, the end of his solitary war. When Jacob Barnes walked into Sergeant Harris's office for the third and final time, the very atmosphere of the place seemed to have changed. Or maybe it was he who had changed. He didn't enter with the uncertain posture of an applicant or the downcast head of a reject, but with the quiet, upright confidence of a man who knew his own worth because he had been forced to prove it. He placed the signed medical waiver on Harris's desk without a word. Harris looked at the paper, at Colonel Madsen's signature, and then he looked up at Jake. The easy salesman's smile was gone, replaced by a rare, genuine flicker of respect. "Well, I'll be damned," Harris said, whistling softly. "You did it, kid. You really did it." There was a new camaraderie in his voice, the acknowledgement of one professional to another who had overcome the odds. The rest of the process was a formality, but now it was charged with a new weight. As Jake raised his right hand to take the oath of enlistment in the small, stuffy office, the words were no longer about escaping a future, but about embracing one he had fought for. "I, Jacob Barnes, do solemnly swear." Every word was sealed not by naive idealism, but by the sweat and pain of the preceding months. He had fought for his place in this brotherhood before he ever even wore the uniform, and that knowledge made all the difference. He wasn't just being allowed into the army anymore. He was finally claiming his place in it. In his final days in Clayton before leaving for basic training, Jake moved with a new gravity. The experience of fighting for the waiver had transformed him in a way no training yet could. He was no longer the naive boy dreaming of his grandfather's glory or fleeing his father's ghost. He was a young man who understood viscerally that commitment was measured not in words, but in perseverance. The tension in his house had eased, replaced by a reluctant respect from his mother and a quiet, profound pride from his father. He had proven to them, and more importantly to himself, that his decision was not a youthful whim, but a serious commitment. As he said goodbye to his town, he no longer felt the desperate need to escape. Instead, he felt a paradoxical gratitude for the struggle it had provided him. Clayton, with its rust and its dead-end streets, had been the crucible that tested him, that gave him a reason to fight. He was ready now, not because he was ignorant of the dangers to come, but because he had already faced failure and refused to be defined by it. The first war of Jacob Barnes was not fought with a rifle in a foreign land, but with a bad knee and an iron will in his small Ohio town. And because he had won that first battle, he was now for the first time in his life truly ready for whatever came next.